I'm Thais Gadalara. I'm a climate journalist from Argentina. And since 2014, I have been covering what today we are going to deep in, that it's the climate negotiations and the famous UN conferences, the COP. So basically, today's presentation is going to be about those recommendations that I would love someone told me 11 years ago when I first went to a conference and I realized it was not like another type of event or forum. It was totally different. A lot of things were happening. So it's a kind of of compilations, because there are a lot of recommendations and a lot of content that I could share with you about how to cover the COPs. But the idea will be to try to take the most of the next hour, and also that you can ask different questions, especially if you are considering to, before this talk or after this talk, to cover the next COP or the next ones. So first of all, just to have a general idea of your knowledge, I would like to know how many of you have covered a COP? 1, 2. Good, that's a lot, I would say. And how many of you are planning or want to cover the next COP30? And not just because you want to go to Brazil, which will be a fair argument, let's be honest. The last one was in Baku, so really, who wanted to? So how many are planning? Okay, almost same amount. Maybe the same question at the end is going to change. So, well, first of all, on the first part, we are going to do a little of brief background of what the convention is, what the COP is, what is when we are talking about the negotiations, in order to then understand how we can cover this process better. And we need to go back a little in time to the same place everyone is talking about, that is Brazil, but this time was in 1992, because it was this big summit, the Rio Earth Summit, that is considered as the first time that in international diplomacy countries decided, not because before they didn't know, but it was the first time that they say, okay, there's an issue, or maybe too many issues related with the impact on the environment of our activities, and we need to do something. We need to try to work on collective action to address those kinds of issues, and to see what are the different opportunities and challenges on the actions that are made. So after that big summit in Rio, they decided to create what is called the three sister conventions. That is something important for you to know, is in the multilateral system, they love acronyms, so everything is about almost Wi-Fi passwords and things like that. But you only need to know the most important ones. So these three conventions under UN are the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the third one is the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. The one that, even when it doesn't receive the relevance or the interest that should have, but that is most popular among the three, is definitely the one on climate change. That is the one that we are going to pay attention or focus on today. But if the last year you hear about the COP on biodiversity, that was related to the second one. That is the one on the CDB. And maybe some of you, if you have read some of column or opinion articles during the last years, that they say that the UN process is not working, that all these environmental problems should be addressed as one. Let me tell you that if things are not working properly, even with these three separation, imagine if we tried to work together all the problems. So in my experience covering UN processes, I think it's good that these environmental issues are separately in terms of the multilateral action, but of course they cannot be 100% disconnected. there are different tracks in each of the negotiations in which they are trying to see how to connect the negotiations. Because naturally, these environmental issues are connected. And even if you do everything okay with climate action, but you don't work on how to take care of biodiversity or conservation, I mean, the result is not going to be positive, and same on the other way. But this, it's maybe a comment that is important, especially when it's a content in which UN process is under attack, and there are a lot of criticism against the process. And as we are going to see, it's an imperfect process. There are a lot of things that they need to improve, but at least this separation and this work in a different way between these problems is something that I think it's important. And also the process under the convention, if you compare with the other two, of course you can see that has more years of experience, or is the oldest child, in the family, who has gone through different good things, bad things, experience, and learned a lot during the process. So the convention, which the different countries ratified it, is the primary international mechanism to address climate change. And the COP, that little word that we usually refer to when talking about the conference, is the conference of the parties, is the main decision-making body of the convention. When you read articles about the COP is starting or what is going to happen in the COP30 in Belém, probably they are not referring to the conference of the party. They are referring about the UN climate change conference. And this difference is something, let's say, is more technical, but it's important for you to know that one thing is the big conference, the event, with the track of the negotiations and with everything that happens around, let's say, it's side events, politicians talking, that it's the COP as a whole event. And another thing, it was technically happen in the negotiations under the COP as a decision-making body, which is what I try, it's not easy, what I will try to encourage you to follow. That it's the most difficult part, the most technical and far away, but in terms of the process is what we need to work and to work properly and with more ambitious. So every year, party meets annually in different locations that the parties decide. I say parties and not countries because it's that how they are organized. For example, EU is one party, but in terms of governments, it's almost the same. And they meet annually to discuss, to negotiate, and to make decisions. And those decisions have to be 100% under consensus. And that is something that it's a little complicated. And I always make this comparison or example that, for example, today, for example, temperatures are increasing here, and let's say, okay, why don't we buy some ice cream? And if we all here in this room, we need to choose one flavor, probably it's going to be complicated. Main complication is that I like mint. So that it's going to be a discussion. But it's something naive as an example, but true. When you think that are almost 200 countries deciding on things that represent a lot of interest, conflict of interest, and basically changing all the traditional way we are doing what we do. And again, with a lot of interest behind. And something important to take into consideration, considering the actual situation, is that a country can ratify the convention, the UNFCCC, then can ratify some of the agreements under the convention or not. There are two different ways. So why I am making this comment today and not, for example, 2 years ago? Because of which country? US. What will be the situation of US next year? Why did I say next year and not now? Yeah.
Because the US has pulled out and they're no longer party, and it takes 1 year for that to go into effect.
Good. That is of the Paris Agreement. So technically, the withdrawal of US from the Paris Agreement, it's going to start on January 27 of next year. Yesterday, the intersessional negotiations end in Bonn, and during these last 2 weeks, US decided not to participate, not with any delegate. That means that they are not going to participate in Belém. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, in terms of rules, they can still be there in Belém, but not next year. Not next year as a deciding party, but they can be there as an observer party because they are going to still be in the convention. Everyone understood that, or do you want me to recap? Because these are the little technical things, but it's good to consider. So again, US is not going to be in the Paris Agreement since January of next year, but at least so far, they didn't decide to withdraw from the convention, from the UNFCCC. So they can still participate as an observer party. That means just to be there, watching the negotiations and watching what other countries decide, and of course, probably having some bilateral meetings with some parties. Yeah.
With Michael Bloomberg paying their fees, like he did in 2016 as well, does that mean that he's paying for anyone to come and participate, or if there's any capacity to participate?
No, because only the national government can participate on the table of US. It's not that, I don't know, if Bloomberg goes there, he can participate. Only the national government is the one who can send an official delegation. It's interesting your question, because when it was the first presidency of Trump, there was this coalition of We Are Still In. That is a coalition composed by a lot of local governments, city governments, even private sector, which besides what Washington decides, they were there just to try to push and to continue with the implementation of the climate agenda nationally, and also trying to build, some work together with others. But it's not that coalition could, take a seat and make decisions in the process. Those formalities are still part of the diplomacy still, because everything can change from one day to another. So the first agreement that we had under the Climate Convention was the Kyoto Protocol, that I guess that some of you at least heard. It was established in the third COP in 1997, but entered into force in 25, and probably you are asking why it took so much time for that to be implemented. And basically it was because US never ratified it. Signed it, but never ratified. And when you do not ratify an agreement, it means that you are not going to put it into force nationally. You're not going to implement it. And what happened is as everything, if US is not on board, a lot of countries start saying, well, should I be here? And even the force of the agreement start, to be reduced, because while US is not on board on the implementation, Canada also withdrew from the protocol in 2011. So even when a first part of the goal was fulfilled, then it was never something strong. As sending a message to the international community that there was an action together between the countries. And an important thing about the Kyoto Protocol, it was that the goals of reducing emission was only something that developed countries should do. It was not about all the world, developed and developing countries working together and nationally on mitigation, on reducing emission. It was only a target who have to fulfill the developed countries. on the argument, of course, that those countries were the ones who have been contributing more historically, and because under the convention and the different agreements, there's something that is called the principle of common but differentiation responsibilities. That means that we all together have to work on climate, but there are some countries, like for example, US or EU, that historically have been more responsible to the problems than the others. So that was like the very first experience on climate diplomacy, that it was a little like a great result, let's say. And then in the process, and as you can see, I mean, we are talking about like decades of the negotiations, so I could be here like a whole day talking about what happened COP by COP, and that would be so boring that I don't want to. But one of the other important things, and that it was really a bad experience, was the failure of Copenhagen. If you hear in a corridor at the climate conference Copenhagen, you are like this, why? Why they're talking about that? That could be really something bad. And the issue was that after the Kyoto Protocol, everyone was saying, well, we need something more global. We need something that could also be not only of a commitment by developed countries, something that also involve developing countries just to show a joint work together to address climate change, something that even is not only about a target on reducing emissions, but also talk about adaptation, that is an agenda of interest by developing countries. And the idea was to the COP in Copenhagen to try in 2009 to try to settle that agreement. But the issue was that that didn't happen, and that the trust between countries like broke a lot, because basically, and I am like making a lot of resume on this, but basically during the last minute, a group of countries appear with a text and say, this is the text, this could be like a good agreement. And the rest of the countries were like, excuse me, no. I mean, we were not part of the discussion on this. This is not how things work here. Remember that everything here should be decided by consensus. So at the end, it was something like the other country says, yes, of course, we welcome your proposal, but we are not going like to say a formal yes to decide on this as consensus. So it was a huge failure on climate diplomacy, and especially it was that something was broken in the trust, especially between developed and developing countries. So after that, Cristiana Figueres started to be like the executive director of the convention, and in a press conference in Cancun, she was asked by a journalist, do you think a global climate agreement is going to be possible? What do you think was her answer? Not in my lifetime, like that. The executive secretary like of the convention. And in her book that she wrote in 2020, she says, when trying like to explain how the following agreement finally happened, that she realized after answering that was not a proper answer, not because of the role that she had, but of this, that she was the one who has to rebuild the trust between countries, that a work together was possible between them. Like, maybe, of course, she was thinking about something very ambitious or with a lot of details that maybe was not what at the end the Paris Agreement was, but at least to have like this idea, this vision that an agreement was possible, no matter the difference, no matter the trust between developed and developing countries. And that change of mind that she had, and that her team and a lot of people around have been doing like since Cancun after Paris, what was made possible to have in 2015, 10 years ago, this makes me feel so old because I was there, so imagine. I know I look young, but not that young. So yeah, this was the photo of a lot of happiness around there. I remember I was in the media press because in the plenary Wi-Fi was not working properly. So we decided to be there at the media center. And I was young at that moment. That was my second COP. And I remember seeing like in front of me a journalist who could be my mother, and she was like crying. And I was like, okay, this is historical. Like, I didn't realize at that moment. I was like more like, okay, I need to go for sources. I am writing and things like that. And of course, achieving like an agreement of the type, and now we're going like to see the details of the Paris Agreement, what is historical. What is going to make history is the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And why the Paris Agreement was historical? First of all, because it was a global agreement. For the first time, developed and developing countries worked together on an agreement on how to address climate action. It has a global goal to limit global warming below 2 Celsius degrees with the efforts to 1.5 Celsius degrees. That basically, I'm not going to enter into technicalities, but the difference will be, for example, for the island countries, like 1.5 is at least an opportunity to survive 2 Celsius degrees. It will make things worse for them. And they were the ones who basically, achieved to have 1.5 on the table. But most important, it doesn't have only a global goal on mitigation that will be to reduce emissions, but also, and in difference with the Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement tries to bring also to the table an agenda that is very important for developing countries and needed, that is adaptation. So Paris Agreement is a climate action agreement on the both sides of the climate action: mitigation, reduction of emissions, and adaptation, how to better prepare to the impacts that we are already having of climate change. Still, 10 years later, mitigation wins in balance in all of the aspects. For example, on finance. More finance, was like, the number was like of all the climate finance that was mobilized in 2023, almost 70% went to, in between 60 and 70% went to mitigation in comparison with adaptation. And what developing countries need more nowadays is for adaptation, because they are more exposed to the impacts of climate. The other thing, the Paris Agreement also had some commitments on finance. During the failure of Copenhagen, one of the positive things was that the developed countries committed to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020. And then with the Paris Agreement decided to reaffirm that goal. But from who listened about talking about this the other day, who wants to resume what happened since that with that goal? There are some of you here, so what happened?
They didn't stand by the commitment to finance it.
Yeah, basically. It's like a little part was fulfilled, but late, two years late. Still, developing countries are waiting the money of the other years, and 100 billion was not even enough. Even the 100 billion that was mobilized was not enough in comparison with what developing countries need. And finance, as we are going to see, is still a very critical issue between countries, because if you tell me that you are going to give me money, you do not give me that money or not in the quality and quantity that you tell me, why I'm going to still trust you that you are going to give me tomorrow or next month again money? So finance is what is making the trust and the work together between the developed and developing world basically too much of difficulty. Of course, one of the questions that always brings the Paris Agreement is, okay, what happened, for example, with the US? They were in, they were out. They were in, then now they are going to be out. The Paris Agreement is not being well implemented in most of the countries. Is there any sanction or something like that? What do you think? And do you think anyone will have signed the Paris Agreement if we have a body who say, well, if you do not fulfill, you have to pay even more money? No. But I mean, those things don't end there. They are like indirect and internal mechanisms in the process that allow us like to control how the implementation is. Spoiler, it's not really good so far. I mean, there are some little things that are positive, but there's a lot of work to be done. But for example, the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions that countries need to submit every 5 years, they are a way on how countries, for example, are going like to implement the goal on how to reduce emissions in order to limit global warming below 2 Celsius degrees or 1.5 degrees. And as we can see in this graphic, definitely we are not going on that pathway. You can see what it says, like 1.5 Paris Agreement goal is where we should be. And let's say the purple, box that you see there is approximately where we are going like to be if the countries implement everything that they are saying on their last NDC that they are going to do. It's not what they are doing. Is if they implement the commitments. These numbers and study are until November 2024. It doesn't contain the last presentation of NDCs because yet not all the countries submit that. Only 21 countries made presentations. And really, they are not the ones we are expecting, like China or EU. They didn't present yet, that are the ones who could make a difference, especially talking about mitigation. Because this year, and this is one of the things that need to happen on the road to Belém, is one of the round of presentations of NDC. So there you have an opportunity of a story to see what happened with the previous NDC, how well the countries implement that or not, and to analyze like the NDC, let's say, for example, of Brazil. It is good, not, its ambition, is what Brazil needs on the road to limit global warming below 1.5. And the last thing that I'm going like to say, I am not here, I mean, they don't need me, but I'm not here to defend not UN processes, the convention of the Paris Agreement. But sometimes, I mean, if you ask me like why during a decade, year by year, like you are still going and covering that process that, like, let's be honest, bad coffee, bad food, I don't sleep well, it's stressful, pessimistic, like, almost like a toxic relationship, something like that. I truly believe that is what it's the system and the process and the agreement that we have. And at least for me as journalist, I want to be there to cover that and to make pressure from communication and covering to politicians, like to implement and to do a proper and ambitious implementation. And how? Well, we need to communicate to the different audience in the best language possible which are the commitments that their governments have done, are doing, or will have to do, or are not doing, in order like for them to have a better condition of living. So everything is imperfect, the process is imperfect. Even the Paris Agreement in 2015, we already knew it was not perfect, but it was like the best possible agreement at that moment with all the countries on board, and now everything is about implementation. The issue with the implementation is that if things were very technical before, now with the implementation it's even worse. Because before the process was like, okay, what should we put? Like, will be a goal to reduce emissions for 1.5, 2, or things like that. And now everything is about, okay, on adaptation, which indicators are we going like to have, or regulation of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and everything gets more technical. So that means that for our editors and producers, it's more boring. This is the best photo that I have on negotiations. I don't know if you realize, but I was doing a TV live reporting, and this guy, he was so sleeping. I mean, I guess probably he was not hearing me running in Spanish talking. And probably after my live video, I was going like to be like him. But I like this photo because it's some of the atmosphere when covering the negotiations. Even my face today looks a little tired because I was in Bonn like last week covering the negotiations. But I mean, it's part of the moment of how the negotiations are. So the most important thing is that after Paris, the process became like really more complicated to follow, and for us to sell to our editors and producers why this matters or how this could be something of interest of our audiences. And you need to know that you're talking with a person who comes from a country in which financial crisis, politics, Maradona, Messi, football, everything is going like to be more important than climate action. So the following recommendations are also from someone who has to, had a lot of challenge daily on how to sell these kind of stories to her editors and producers. And I would say that the first one will be to try to understand like all this complex work. And by that, I'm not going like to pretend that you in the next 5 minutes are going like to understand everything. Even myself, like 10 years later, every year you have to learn something different because also the process is evolving and there are some things that change. But the most important thing is that for you to contact the negotiators, the experts, and ask them like the questions in order for you to understand, because then you're going like to be the translators to your different audiences. So in my case, for example, I always ask, if it's necessary, 3 times the same questions like to different experts, just to understand like what the Article 6 on carbon markets really meant when was the discussion in Glasgow. Because if I didn't understand that properly, then I couldn't communicate that on a 1 minute, TV live reporting. So one of those complexities that I, for example, bring here is that we don't talk about countries, we talk about parties, but also countries negotiate by groups. Yeah, they negotiate with others. And they can be negotiating like one topic with, in one group, and then another topic with another group. They can negotiate or make decisions on a topic as a country, individually, or they can talk on behalf of a group. And basically, this group are like formed because of geographic proximity, economic interest, climate vulnerabilities, and they try to defend like equal goals and priorities. So what to do considering that technicality? I would say like try to analyze which are the common goals on the groups, why the groups are defending some of the interest, and try to identify if there are some conflict of interest. For example, I will say try to always look on China and what is the role of China, because sometimes you hear China and it looks like, wow, they are talking as if they are in the same conditions that Tuvalu. And maybe it's not like that, because China still has the label of developing country. So they don't have the same responsibility, for example, in terms of mobilizing finance to developing countries as EU or US. See what happens also in a group when climate deniers are in power. For example, during the last years, I have been following Argentina, because now is under a climate denier, also as US, and how Argentina was like playing in the atmosphere of negotiations when it's usually under G77, also in some cases with Brazil and Uruguay, especially regarding everything that is connected with land and forest and the emissions implicated on those sectors. And another complexity is relating about how the parties negotiate. But the first time that I entered a negotiation was in Bonn in 2015. And I was like, really? This is how like the governments negotiate? And there was like this on a screen, there was a text, and a country was like, no, I want must. No, I want to. And for me it was like, what am I doing here? I couldn't believe it. But then with the years, I understood that a different verb, a comma, a point, a word that appears or it doesn't there, it means responsibility. It means implementation. So even when it looks like that it's something like, come on guys, let's say what you want to do, this is the way, at least they have so far, to make the decisions. So what it's important to know for us as journalists is that every word, every wording matters in the negotiations, and that everything that appears under brackets means that there's no consensus there. So for example, there you can see, this is a paragraph of one of the drafts of the new climate financial goal that was discussed last year in Baku. And you can see basically that everything is under different brackets, with different options about who should receive the money of the new climate financial goals. And if you read carefully, even when it looks like it's the same, it's not the same in each of the options that are under brackets. So when you have a text with a lot of brackets, it means that you are very far from achieving consensus. And the work should be like to try to see, okay, where we can find like common positions in order to try to erase and leave the brackets. So as I mentioned before, the idea will be for you when following the negotiations, of course, if the next COP is going like to be your first COP, maybe you're going like to be a little lost, but at least understanding these kind of things, that the wordings, the verbs, the things that appear under brackets are the one in which are conflicts between countries. Behind all of these things, there are stories to tell, and there are positions to try to analyze why those differences are happening. So for example, this was, I love colors, but colors mean different things in my analysis, and this was how I was like when one of another draft of the new climate financial goals appears. I was like highlighting like things that I thought could be like under discussions then by parties. So for example, why I choose this one: encourage developing country parties to make contributions. When it was a climate financial goal that was supposed to define how the mobilization of money was going like to be from developed countries to developing countries. When I highlight this, I was thinking in a country that probably at the plenary was going to oppose to this. Who was going to be?
China.
China. Yeah? And for example, when I say at least $300 billion, who are going to be happy with that? EU. And who are going to be unhappy? The rest of the world, basically, that it was what happened. Yeah? So those are the things. When I put, for example, in yellow, mitigation and adaptation, that was something that developing countries were going like to consider good. These ones maybe multilateral developing banks, something that maybe they were going to see with concern, because the idea of the goal on climate finance was to be only by public money as sources. So those are the kind of things of the work. Again, probably you're thinking this is too much, and you don't have to expect to do this like on your first COP. If I see the report that I did on my first COP, better not to, because probably I'm going like to find a lot of mistakes. But my first advice or my main advice will be like, I mean, first you are here, so you're already going like to have a basic knowledge that I didn't have 11 years ago, but also then like try to work like informally in a collaborative way during the COPs or previously to the COP with the people that have been to another COPs in order to ask them also these kind of questions like why this could be an issue or not. My second advice and recommendation will be like just to focus on the negotiations and be careful with what I call the show. And basically you're going like to say, but most of the coverage that we see about the COP is about the show and not about the negotiations. And what I mean with the show is like everything that is created with the intention on like communicate about that and maybe not paying attention on the difficulties, on the challenge, on the lack of trust between countries, on the lack of ambition on the implementation of the agreement. So this is still for me like the best example because in my experience, everyone hear about that when was the COP26 in Glasgow, there was a declaration in which more than 100 countries pledged to end deforestation by 2030. And I remember my producer saying, Thais, we need to talk about this. And I was like, yes, but it's a declaration. I need to talk about that. There's no consensus yet on Article 6 on carbon markets. I didn't say Article 6 because if I say Article 6, I lost him. So I only say carbon markets. You know that for Argentina, Brazil, it's really important, things like that. But why I will consider this as part of the track of show?
Positive statement.
I mean, it's really good to sell this as marketing, but most importantly, it's a declaration. If we want now, like some years later, see what happened with this, there's no process of implementation, of control. Not even the indirect control that the Paris Agreement has as a formal agreement. So, and it's really, really good for countries, especially for the one who has the presidency of the COP, to have a lot of declarations, a lot of announcements that are related with climate action, that are made in the context of the COP, but that they are not technically related with the process of implementation of the Paris Agreement. And for us, to be honest, I mean, this makes more titles than talking about little things that are under discussions, very technical on the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So this is one of the differences between commitments and pledge and declarations. In the case of commitments, let's just say, example, the Paris Agreement, you need to have consensus of the parties, and you have different deadlines, methods to track process, are legally binding, or at least some of their parts are legally binding. And in the case of the pledge or declaration as the one to end deforestation that was made in Glasgow, they are made by individual countries or only by a group of countries. They don't have a specific framework to see how to implement it, how to negotiate the implementation, or how to control it. And basically, they are voluntary. By this, I am not meaning not to cover this. I mean, a good investigative journalism opportunity will be to try to see, let's see what happened with all the declarations that happened, I don't know, in Glasgow, or in Egypt, or even last year. Where is the status? And that will be something really good, because maybe you can find that, well, for some countries, they, I don't know, that then translate into the new policies or new law, or basically was nothing, and it was really good, greenwashing or political marketing during the COP. The same can happen when a country with a company decides to make an agreement on a project on renewable energy. That is great. It's climate action, it's transition. But it's not the implementation of the Paris Agreement. It's not what countries need to discuss and make decisions about during the COP. So on that, it will be the advice: track, analyze, see what happened with those promises and statements. And that, I think it will be something that you can do, not for the 2 weeks of the COP, but that you can do during the rest of the year, and you are creating content related with the COP. And also, part of the show that is important, this investigation was shown yesterday in another talk, and it was really good. It was about this beautiful guy who was a CEO of the national oil company of Emirates when was COP28 presidency. And basically, they used that role also to continue expanding fossil fuel projects around the world. And the issue with that, it was not to, of course, we have to talk about that. The issue was that we were at the 4th day of the COP, and everyone was still talking about that. And at a point, I mean, if we want to see what happened with that related to the COP, well, it will be good if this has an impact, for example, on the negotiations per se. If there was no mention on fossil fuel during the negotiations, well, maybe it's because, you know, like the COP president is an oil guy. Maybe it's because of that. But the point is, like, all the context around a COP could be an issue and a distraction, basically created by them in order not to cover what matters, that are the negotiations. And regarding fossil fuel, because it's something that appeared in every COP, my question will be if there's any mention of fossil fuels in the Paris Agreement. What do you think?
Probably not.
Probably not? There's no mention. Again, do you think that they would have signed it if there was mention of fossil fuels?
Probably not.
Probably not. And with 100% consensus, basically, yes. And then my next question that I know Alice here, she's going to like that. There's a lot of saying about, well, we came from COPs in Egypt, Emirates, Azerbaijan, all petrostates. Finally, the COP is in Brazil. And I was like the Latin American in the room saying, well, you know, Brazil is also a petrostate, a really big one in our region. Maybe, of course, there are some differences with the other countries, more on the political side, democratic side, and things like that, that are important. But still, with the next presidency, we are talking about like a country in which Lula is still talking about, and they are allowing, last week they approved explorations on new projects of oil in the Amazon basin. So that is again like where the COP is going to be. And again, we need to talk about that, but we need to see if that is going like to have an impact on the negotiations. If there's going like to affect the fact that we have an ambitious wording on fossil fuels or not, in the sense of having like a transition from that. So it will be good like to try to how the show can affect or is already affecting the negotiations, how the largest emitting sector promotes the advancement or the delay of the climate action in the negotiations. And related with that, it will be my third recommendation, that is to cover the position of the countries, but do not defend them. Usually what happens is that your media is going to ask you, like, just follow like the position of your country or the position of the country of from where the audience is. And what I have been seeing during the last decade is that sometimes when you read the coverage, it's basically the country speaking. It's like the article and the reporting is, I don't know, the EU position or the African position. And okay, what about like the journalists besides the position of the country? And that sometimes happens, I don't blame the colleagues, sometimes happen because the delegates know, for example, how to give you daily a lot of information and details, and maybe you don't only listen that source. So that could be like something like very, very tricky. So I would say like try to ask why the country is accepting or rejecting like some wording or some text, why they're having like a position specifically, I don't know, on finance or on mitigation or on adaptation. Try to listen all the voices from different countries, especially if you are following the position of a developing country. Try to also talk with developed ones. Try to also listen to the experts from civil society that are in the rooms as observers following the negotiations. And of course, fact check the beautiful speeches of politicians. Because sometimes you're going to realize that they go to the COP committing to commitments they already commit in the past. Honestly, I mean, so that would be also something in which you can in which there are a lot of opportunity for investigative journalism. And related with the positions, last year, I don't know if you read about this news. it appeared like globally in different media about the decision of Milei of withdrawing the delegation, like from one day to another, of Baku. And I was the person who broke the news. I don't know if that was good. But there were some people in Baku from Argentina and some people in Argentina that they were not happy with me of like telling the story. When I had done like all the fact check, everything, even it was a little like, not, I don't know, complicated, but I used my strategy on how to like check the information at a point, and but they weren't happy. Like I was not like covering properly or taking care of the country, not the government, but the country. And at a point I was so angry. I was like, I am not civil society, I'm not an activist, I'm a journalist, and I have 3 sources, and someone directly from the government told me yes, and even she allowed me like to put her on the record. So that was it. I mean, I did all the, you know, like all the checking that we are like teach in journalistic school. So that was like the thing, and it's an example also on how sometimes people expect that us as journalists, like that we talk in the name of the position of the country and not, we are covering. Then without the recording, I can share with you how was that I checked this information and how I broke the news, but not with the recording. Fourth, I will say focus on 1 or 2 topics, no more. If it's your first negotiation that you are covering, I will say just 1. And basically, why? Because as you can see, everything is so technical, there are a lot of topics, and it's impossible to cover everything. Even today, I choose 1 or 2 topics to follow, because only with one topic, a lot of things could happen. So let's say it's with finance. Okay, do the research, what has happened in finance during the previous negotiations, what should happen like in Belém about that, who are the experts that I can talk with, like to understand the technicalities behind that, and try to find the story behind the wordings, the brackets, and everything that is around that topic. Some of the topics that in the next COP you could have opportunities to do journalism are finance and how to properly implement what it says on finance on the Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, finance and this beautiful roadmap on how to scale up finance to 1.3 trillion that no one knows what that means, but they will have to talk about it. Adaptation, and the indicators for the implementation of the global goal on adaptation, just transition work program. It had to be finalized in Baku, and that didn't happen. So it's going like to be something for Brazil to discuss again and put that on the table. Wording on fossil fuels, we're going like to have a phase down fossil fuels, phase out, transitioning away on fossil fuel or nothing. And if any of you don't know the difference, I can later explain the technicalities on the meaning of these 3 wording that I mentioned. And there's a lot of opportunity this year. I know that a lot of things are happening around the world besides the COP, but this year is the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. So imagine all the opportunities of stories that are, even for example, how the anniversary has been impacted by the wars that are happening after the pandemic, that there are a lot of opportunities also to connect this with another things that are happening on the agenda. And my last recommendation will be like to try to cover climate politics during the year. Like try not to only cover about the negotiations during the 2 weeks, like for example in November in Belém, because in my experience, everything was about also try to teach the audience and prepare the audience for the COP. So for example, 2 months before the COP, I started writing in the newsletter on each edition is about one of the main topics that year is going like to be negotiated, so that then when I am, for example, now in Belém and I mention the roadmap, the audience already know what is that. and I can link to the previous edition. So try also to connect, but not only on the negotiations, but also to a lot of other things that are happening. Like, for example, a new policy that is settled in your country, even a sport event, if it's in the middle of summer with higher temperatures, a climate event, like this week here was the London Climate Week. All of the little things could be connected to the commitments that were made in the past or the decisions that need to be discussed in the following COP. And something important, please, don't use like in your titles things about like it was a success or it was a failure, because after Paris, everything, as I mentioned, is more technical. So it's not really about like, I mean, you need to have something really big. You're not going like to have a new agreement. It's about if you do like, if you move forward, if you did good steps, if you're stuck, or basically if you are coming back. You know, it's about do that kind of analysis. But it's not that you're going like to celebrate again like a new big climate agreement. It's about making like more steps in the right direction or not for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And last, there was a session today that I think was really good in terms of digital security. So I'm not going like to talk about this too much. But considering what happened to most of the people who were in Egypt in 2022, I would say that even at the UN conference, like implement everything that you hear before on the digital security session, because even in a UN conference, there could be a lot of issues with security, especially in this case was because, well, a lot of issues with the presidency of Egypt, and even inside the venue, there were a lot of things, for example, in journalism with intimidation and things like that. So my learning was that, okay, I need also like to prepare. And for example, last year in Azerbaijan, considering that it's not the best country to do journalism, we prepared a lot like with digital security and try also to connect like, there are different organizations who help journalists on that. Or in my case, for example, I always ask Amnesty in my country, but they are international. And I will say always try to, even in Brazil, what do you recommend me like to do as journalists? Because at the end of the day, we are talking about things that bother to a lot of people. So yeah, that will be also like my last recommendation. And as I am also an audience here, I started last night to change how I was going like to share with you some sources, but still I cannot, because I'm new on this, they are not allowing me yet to share like with a link. So then the organization, we are going like to share once I can this weekend, create a link. But my idea is going like, you're going like to see more resources, and I'm going like to be updating this like from here to on the road to COP, so it can be useful for you, like in general on the coverage of negotiations, but also specifically this year around the COP. In case that you have any doubt, there's my email there. And yeah, I don't know if we have time for one question, I think, because we are almost there, but yeah, thanks for the attention.